Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Emily Moyer. Michael Wan is wearing his awesome Susquehanna Alchemy shirt that is my favorite because it reminds me of Bubble Yum in the 80s. This is episode number 24 of Playing the Glass Bead Game. Michael, how are you?
I am doing well today, Emily. Thank you for having me on your Zoom platform. It's always a pleasure when your generosity is so expansive that you put me on the Zoom.
I put you on the Zoom. I love the voice that comes on now when you push the recording. It like reminds me of like the stewardess reminding you to like put your seatbelt on and bring your tray table up or whatever, right? On the back of your chair up on there. It's like okay,
when that voice first came out, yeah, that definitely. Well, what's funny is I think I talked about that the first month. Like every single time I went on Zoom, I made a comment of that voice, like to whomever was on the other side. And I don't anymore. And it's because it worked.
It worked.
Because it doesn't bother me anymore. I have acclimated to the Zoom Android tonality. I don't know how deep that goes, but I'm at least being honest with myself and recognizing it doesn't rub me the wrong way it used to do. And that's how the two-step works.
So I think for some reason, that men are more susceptible to those voices than women are. And I think that's why they often use women, like Siri is a female voice, Alexa is, this voice is. And I never would have thought that. Like, I don't think in those terms, but I had this particular experience with an old friend of mine who I haven't seen in a long time, though. Like, he lives here now. So Sheldon, if you're out there, hello. But Sheldon was the first person that I knew that like had either Siri on his phone or his car and had it all hooked up. And so you were hearing the directions talk to you, right? This was like back in the early 2000s. And we were going to a party, like an underground warehouse party. And it was the middle of the night. It was already after midnight, right? And so we're going and he's listening to that thing, give it directions, right? And it was like weird. It was like behind a step, this was the part that didn't make any sense to me. We were going to a venue we had been to before. So we knew where it was, but he was following the directions she was saying, and it was taking us to the wrong place because the directions were like one step behind. So we drove around for like a half an hour with him listening to her because he was driving and me saying, we know how to get there. We've been there before. And he couldn't hear me, and I'm a real person. He's doing what this woman says. And like, and then later I had a friend, Jason, who I was going to parties with, and he liked to listen to that girl too. And his would be always behind a step. And I'd be like, Jason, like, I'm pretty sure I know and sometimes we'd be going to somewhere we hadn't been before, but I'm pretty good at sussing this stuff out because I've been to probably 1,000 warehouse parties at this point. And I'm pretty, like, I just understand where most of them are. And so if we're in anywhere near the area, I can generally find it. But he wouldn't stop listening to it. And it was almost like it was like had an obsessive control of his mind. There's something about that robotic female toned voice, and Sheldon is a straight guy and Jason is a gay guy, right? And so it isn't really, at first I thought it was like some sort of weird, like female voice controlling the man, some sort of weird android sexuality. I don't know if it has anything to do with that or not. Jason isn't, you wouldn't know by looking at him or whatever. So I don't know how this all works. But like, I'd be sitting there being like, dude, I know how to get there. Let's just go, like, let's cook, like 2 weeks ago when you didn't have this, we just drove to the party without her. Why do we need her now? Right? Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. But because I see you as being particularly resistant to a lot of the technology stuff, so that and neither of them are, both of them sort of like the technology and are more in symbiosis with it on some level. But since you experienced that as well, that you've just kind of assimilated that in, I wonder what it is.
Well, those are a bunch of interesting ideas, which you just presented. The idea of seeing a human being default to the Siri voice is particularly for like directions like that. That drives me up a wall because you see it happening. Undoubtedly, there had to have been a lot of thought put into like what that voice sounds like, what the accents are. And like as you're describing that, like, what was popping, particularly as it relates to men, what was popping into my mind has to do with like, probably since the 60s or the 70s, like all men, like particularly men, like, men and women have different dynamics with men and women, and our dynamics, a lot of it is culturally determined, and it begins with our first relationships, like, sons with their mothers and daughters with their fathers. And then that kind of sets the tonality of like how one relates with the opposite sex for the remainder of their lives. I mean, that's just psychology. And when you go and you look at what was happening, like, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and like with the household and like men and women and blah, blah, blah. The point I'm going with all of this is like all men, and I'll just speak to like Western United States men, like there's a certain sort of, and it's gotten stronger and stronger as like, the normal dynamic between a household is broken down and everyone has been made crazy, is like they've become susceptible of like to women, a woman's voice, their mother's voice, in a way that they haven't been before. And like there's this whole thing of like needing to please, and like in a way which wasn't done like back in the like pre-World War II. I mean, that was probably something else. So all of that being said is like, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like in a tonality of a certain female voice, just in terms of like listening to it, like that, without a doubt. But you're also right in the fact that there is this underlying, like, they're pushing this sexual connection. This gets all like Freudian, like, with like the Oedipus complex, but like, they start to then go and both for like men and women to create like sexual connection to this android sort of thing. And you talk about the voice, and this is what's popping in my mind. This is like maybe a year ago, I think, like there were commercials. I can't remember what it was for. It may have been like an Amazon commercial, and whatever the Amazon voice is. And it was showing this woman, and she was like listening to the voice. It was like a male android voice. And she was like really like, developing feelings to this voice, and like not listening to her husband. Her husband was painted as being like a bumbling fool. And then like whenever she hears this special like android voice, and then like the last scene has her like in a bathtub in this kind of like sexy sort of environment. And then you could see like, and like, that's how it works. And like there all is many levels of like of creating emotional connection to the voices, like that is definitely part of the psychology of all of it.
So okay, so two things. I'm going to bookmark that. I'm going to talk about the sound that sort of entrances me, because it's not the voices from the phone, right? But I'm well aware of what does a similar thing to me. But okay, and I'm only saying for the YouTube censors, I'm just saying this for educational purposes. This is not the topic of the discussion here. Have you ever heard the term autoeroticism?
Autoeroticism, like
Yeah.
when you reduce the oxygen into your lungs during sex,
Right. Well, the only way that I'd ever heard
Michael Hutchinson.
Correct. It was when some of there's been more than one, but I think he was the first one I remember. When
right, they implied that
dead.
Robin Williams as well.
Correct. They were found dead with the belt around their neck, and the article will always say that there were signs that they were doing autoeroticism or something like that, right? And when Sheldon was driving around in his automobile with the voice telling him what to do, to me that seemed like a better way to explain the autoeroticism seemed to fit that phenomenon better than the other thing, right? And so like I've always thought right, like so like I think when I think of as we move into that, I don't know if that is really a thing or not a thing. Apparently it is. I don't think that that's necessarily what those two were doing when they died, but that's a sure way to make people like turn off to exploring any further, right? For sure, or at least most people. But when we are in a more technological age now than certainly we were when Hutchins passed, right? kind of thing, and that this is like an updated version, like that term would describe the updated version. Like the voice could literally tell you to ride your car off the cliff, just like something in your psyche, if that other form of it is really a thing, tells you to keep going, even though obviously you're heading no place good, right? But this is like the transhumanist form of that sort of idea, right? And especially because a lot of times people are like, when it was happening with Sheldon, he's driving around in his car, I'm like, this is fucking autoeroticism, right? So anyway, like that kind of makes that mind comparison to me. But for me, the thing that like sort of grabs me, do you remember when they introduced Dolby Surround in movie theaters, and before the movie started, it would go wow, like that? The audience is listening, right? Now, not the voice part, but that sound, that all-encompassing sort of vibrational sound, like that definitely does something to me. Because when I first got into, the first time I ever experimented with a hard drug, right? That was the immediate effect. Before I felt any of the other physiological effects in my head, it felt like that, right? And then I proceeded to continue doing that drug for over a year, trying to get that feeling again, which I never did, right? There was something about that was like, whoa, like, right? And so for me, that kind of all-encompassing sound, and I think that's obvious with my like of techno and dance music and whatnot. And, you know, it's every once in a while, I'll hear like a bass line or a tone or a drum or something, and I'm just like, whoa, I want to hear that again and again and again and again and again, right? It's very rarely a vocal thing. It's always something with like a deep bass kind of feel to it for me. And I don't know if that's a leftover from stuff as a kid, or from, you know, the duties we used to perform close to the particle accelerator that may have made that noise, or something like that, right? But anyway, that's the sound that sort of moves me into another space. I don't know that one would call it like a hypnotized space. I guess it could, in some ways, could be hypnotizing, in other ways activating, but that's the sort of tone or sound that really moves me from like my average everyday activity to like some other space.
What I find interesting about what you just said, particularly as it relates to your response to bass. And then going back to like this idea of like how men and women have certain just naturally programmed like connections to like men, and it's probably true too, like, but it's different, like, you know, like boys to their mothers and girls to their fathers. And as you're describing like how you respond to bass and you need to hear, or like certain things like that, and you need to hear it over and over again, like I'm that way with melody. Like there's certain melodies, but like, you know, like it took me a long time to really understand, and I was fascinated by this, to realize how people listen to music differently. Like, you know, some people like I don't remember lyrics if a song has lyrics, but like what I always like, melody is like what's in my mind. And like you're describing bass and all of that sort of stuff. So let's go back to that whole sort of like, you know, son and mothers and daughters with fathers, like, you know, the bass, like that is really the, you know, the ultimate sonic quality associated with a father, with your father. And particularly like, if you want to get into like, you know, deeper levels of psychology, like when a man lowers his voice, like, you know, there's like, go and pay attention to like two men when they get heated, or when the energy, like whether it's like they get scared or like startled, and some men's voice goes up and some men's voice goes up. Hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? Like, you know, those two different qualities. So the point being is like the deeper the voice is on this deep psychological, like it's more empowering. It sounds more like a growl. It's more protective. And so like, I'm going to suggest that there's something like associated with this, you know, and you can take that like general truth and apply that into like, you know, the sonic controls. And the same thing with a mother's voice to a son, that's going to be melodic, like, you know, the sing-songy voice, and like how like a male child, and obviously like, again, like the daughters associate with their moms, but it's different. Like, you know, how that like hooks into my, like the wiring of my brain or my psychology.
So, and now this, I love this part because we can take it into the natural world and then into your, sort of the way that you describe like the inversion in the technological world, right? To a certain extent, although they kind of mirror each other in some ways. So what you're describing is basically, so there are components to speakers called woofers and tweeters. And in nature, we have dogs or wolves or something like that, and we have birds, right? And so listen to the beautiful song the bird is singing and whatever, right? And then there's like a deep growl of a dog barking or a wolf or a coyote roaring or something like that, right? And then the same thing, the speakers, the tweeters are where the high ends come from in the sound system, and the woofers are where the
right
speaker sounds come from, right? And so these polarities are present in the natural world and in our technology, and both have a similar but different kind of effect on our mood, on our psyche, and our ability to be controlled, and our ability to experience joy, like all, whatever, like it moves our body in certain ways. You see kids skipping down the street, listening to the songbird, and then you see me dancing in a dark warehouse and to, the sound that moves me or whatever. But the amount of metaphysical space that these tones occupy in our mind, whether they be natural or whether they be created, affects everything from our cellular matrix to our connections to people, right? To the matrix inside and the matrix outside, and how we view the day and how we view nature. And is the world, it goes back to one of our original questions, is this world a friendly or a dangerous place? Right? And think about how they've co-opted this. I mean, look at Twitter with the bluebird, the songbird, right? The songbird kind of, it invited everybody in, and now everybody is sort of writing their own their own path to the gulag on it, based on looking at Twitter histories and whatnot. And of course, there's Project Bluebird and Over the Rainbow, where the bluebirds sing, and and then you think about like how much people love dogs, and I love dogs too. And of course, dog, like is the inverse of God in some ways. Like, it's the word, it's the same letters, and we always you hear the saying like, I will only wish I was the person my dog thinks I am, and that kind of goes to that conversation about the spirituality level. But look at what's happened with like the elevation on a certain level of dogs in our society, and then they're wearing clothes, and people spend as much money on their dog as they do on a child. And I'm not even saying this is a bad thing or a good thing, but it's been something that has been this whatever this is with the dogs did not exist until 25 years ago. It's a phenomenon of the last quarter century that dogs have. I mean, think about this. Dogs and cats are the biggest stars on YouTube. Right. And now otters, we like the otters. We watch the river otters from Japan. They're pretty funny. But we have our woofers and we have our tweeters, and they're present everywhere. And they're so and it's kind of like an amplified archetype. It's like it's different than the way we normally think of archetypes, but it's so symbolically amplified, right? And think about what's going on with birds aren't real right now. Right. And there's so many other uses of the word bird. You have the scooters that are called birds. The most popular national chain of like mid-level barbershops is called Birds. And you go in there and you get like a beer while you're having your haircut and whatnot, but they're super masc-Nazi in there, right? So there's all of this. But when people hear bird, they feel like, oh, this is a nice place. I can go and relax or whatever, right? Think about how many dog spas there are everywhere, right? Like we are surrounded with this amplification of the symbology of what birds and dogs represent. And then we have that moving into the sound world, and our reality is controlled by sound. Mm-hmm. To a different degree, in a different way, and to a different extent, light. But I actually think, sound is really much more I think that's a more prevalent form of mind control than light.
They've always said that was they mentioned that in the beginning of the glass bead game, mm-hmm. the importance of the music of a society sets the tone of the society. Mm-hmm. Like this is this is an ancient knowledge of controlling people.
Yeah.
all of the Eastern texts, I think Confucius, I think that's where like they first started talking about like the importance of music and the quality of the music and what it creates within the people that listen to it.
Have you ever been to a gong meditation?
Yeah.
All right. So Sonia had a workshop once where she had a gong player there that was just, I'd never heard it before. Right. And it was crazy. Like he just has that thing and he's moving the thing on it. But like after a few minutes, when I was fully immersed in it, I had my eyes closed. I thought I was in a warehouse in a dark room listening to techno because I could hear all these other sounds inside of it. Right. Like it was that it was very deep, but I started to hear it boom, 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 like all this stuff that I know is right. I'm like, how can all of those layers be coming from that thing? And he did it for about a half an hour. And by the end of that, I thought I was in another world. Right. And so the ability to create, like not only to make a transformative experience, but to create the impression that other things are there that aren't there. Right. In terms of like the instruments or notes of sound that like there shouldn't, that isn't supposed to exist within the gong range. Right. But if you can create a thick and full enough and like powerful enough background, whether it's the mind or whether the sound's doing it themselves, create the other layers on top. Ooh, that's reality building right there. That's, complete, sometimes I wonder if we're just like all together in some little room or hall laying down and someone is there in the room making this noise and all this bullshit that we live inside of is being created by our own mind, right? Like sometimes when I look at the news, I'm like, how is it that like the craziest, wackiest thought that I ever had that I'm like, Emily, don't even think that is like front page of news now.
Right.
We are doing this.
It's yeah. An interesting idea.
Hey everybody, you just listened to the opening clip from episode number 24 of Playing the Glass Bead Game with myself and Michael Wan. We got into some interesting stuff that sort of took off from some experiences we each had over the course of the last week. And we got into this sort of area where we were looking at archetypes and technologies and the different ways in which they present themselves to us in every aspect of our lives, the way that they interact with each other and the way that they're playing with us. And it went into some interesting spaces that I think we're going to pursue in future episodes. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the clip. If you would like to watch the full episode, you can join us on Patreon at the Project Kids level or over on projectkids.locals.com. All of the links to join us, as well as a description of the entire show, is in the description box below. Alrighty, everybody have a wonderful week, and we will talk to you later. Oh, also, if you would like a complimentary episode and haven't received one yet, feel free to hit me up. Or if you would like a free day at the Project Kids Social Club, you can hit me up for that as well. All right, guys. Bye-bye.